So in the last video, I talked a little about the harshness of life on Alcatraz, the isolation and despair. To change it up in this video, I'll share a little bit about why some inmates incarcerated on Alcatraz Island would have preferred it to other federal prisons. There are four characteristics about life on Alcatraz that would have undoubtedly appeared in the pro category on a list of pros and cons, and that pun was completely intended. The first thing was the hot water. At least for early inmates, this would have been an amenity unavailable at other federal prisons. We won't mistake this as a humanitarian stance taken by the administration at Alcatraz. Rather, the reported usage of hot water for inmate showers was to acclimate the prisoners to the hot water, which would further deter them from attempting to brave the freezing cold waters of San Francisco Bay in an attempt to escape. The fear was that if prisoners were used to cold water, the bay might not have that deterrent effect. The second factor was the food. Despite the reputation of Alcatraz as a harsh prison, the food was considered to be very good. In fact, a lot of people claimed it was the best food in the entire federal prison system. In addition to being good food, it was plentiful. Even today, we have prisoners who probably do not get the recommended caloric intake in prison, so it's sometimes surprising to consider that a prison that operated in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, which was designed to break men down into compliance, had a history of serving pretty good meals. The title of this video, "It was rich, it was heavy, it was greasy, it was good," is a quote attributed to William Baker, AZ number 1259, describing the food. Warden Johnston, who had experience at a Folsom prison and San Quentin prison in California, believed that well-fed men were better behaved, and because of the scarcity of processed foods at the time and the isolated nature of the island, meals were generally cooked from scratch, which made them that much better. Here's the menu for breakfast on the last day of operation of USP Alcatraz. Breakfast was the only meal served that day before prisoners were shipped off the island to other federal prisons. Meal entrees for lunch and dinner would have regularly included fried chicken, pork chops, meatloaf, or corned beef. They would have been served with soups, vegetables, fruits, fresh baked bread, coffee or tea, with regular desserts. The third characteristic was the low population. As I mentioned in a previous video, A block, seen here, was never fitted with tool-hardened bars and was never used for permanent living quarters. This left B, C, and D blocks to house all inmates. B and C blocks had a combined 336 cells, and D block, which was the treatment unit, had 36 cells plus 6 solitary confinement cells. You can see those here. So here's a view of the second and third tier of D block, a regular D block cell, and then here's the door of one of the isolation or solitary confinement cells. A couple of cells at the end of C block would have been used as bathrooms for on-duty guards. So we're talking about a capacity to house around 376 prisoners maximum. In the operations of prison, that's a pretty small number. I mentioned Frank Weatherman in the last video. Weatherman was notable since his prisoner number, AZ number 1576, was the last number issued. We talked about him in the last video being the last prisoner out of Alcatraz because he was the last prisoner assigned to Alcatraz. So the total number of people who served time at Alcatraz was already low. We know that at least 30 men returned for a second stay at Alcatraz, and being given a new number, not their original number, the number of people who served was even lower, probably around 1,545 total inmates across 29 years of history. Today in Texas, there are more than 30 prisons that house more inmates daily than Alcatraz housed in its entire history. 1,545 inmates is fewer than the number of daily public visitors to the island. So, what this low number meant that the daily population would have also been low. So, we know that we could have housed about 336 prisoners in B and C block, add on around 40 more in D block, but we never would have reached this capacity. The average daily population would have been somewhere around 260 inmates. This would have been beneficial to inmates because crowding produces stress in the form of more noise, there's fewer resources, less food, reduced privileges or freedom. And as little as inmates may have had at any particular point in USP Alcatraz, it would have been worse with a larger population. As an example, according to the 1956 regulations for inmates' documents, we're looking right up here at this daily routine. The daily routine would have called for a morning wake-up bell to sound at 7 a.m., with breakfast being served at 7:30 a.m. Today, in many prisons, breakfast can be served as early as 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. This is due in large part to the number of inmates that need to be fed. In particular, if you're serving meals in dining halls, serving each meal can take hours. At Alcatraz, all inmates could be served in 20 to 30 minutes. The final factor I'm going to discuss in this video is the single occupancy cell. So if you go to the prison today, the only way you would, if you went to prison today, and this is probably true of any prison, whether it's a state or federal prison, the only way you'd be placed in a single occupancy cell would be if you were segregated. In Alcatraz, every inmate had a cell to himself. This single cell characteristic would be enough to reduce a lot of stress related to prison life. In a place that doesn't offer much privacy, by design, this factor would have been invaluable to inmates. Another thing we forget sometimes when we think about prison is that not all inmates are treated equally. Some inmates are more violent, some are more at risk for victimization. Fear of violence is a major part of incarceration, so the single occupancy cell would have reduced the stress as the cell would have been a definite place of safety. So this video was not intended to make Alcatraz sound like a wonderful place or anything like that, but simply to dispel part of the myth that it was the devil's island and nothing more than that.